Nobody moved. That was the thing I kept coming back to afterward. The diner had 11 people in it, and when it happened, not one of them moved. The sound was sharp enough that the conversation at the counter stopped. The coffee cup the waitress was holding stayed suspended in the air for a full second. She didn't fall. She didn't cry. She put her hand to her face and looked at him with an expression that I can only describe as very still, not frightened, not even surprised. Just still, the way a person goes still when something has happened that they are already deciding how to carry. He was still talking when I walked over. He didn't know yet what he had done. None of us did, entirely. Let me tell you about the diner first, because places have context and context matters. The Anchor was on the main road into town, about 2 miles from the gate of Camp Legion's outer perimeter. It was the kind of place that had existed in that specific form for decades. Corner booths, laminated menus, coffee that was reliably hot and not reliably good. The particular accumulated weight of a building that has served the same population long enough that it has absorbed the rhythms of that population entirely. Military families ate there. Off-duty personnel ate there. Locals who had lived alongside the base for generations ate there and had opinions about the coffee that they would share if you gave them 30 seconds. I had been eating at the Anchor for 6 years, which is how long I had been stationed at Legion. I was a gunnery sergeant, enlisted, infantry, a career that had involved 11 years of service and various deployments I will not detail here. I was in the diner that morning because I was on a late start. My wife was visiting her mother in Virginia, and I had no particular reason to cook for one. I mention my wife briefly here because she matters to the account, though she was not present for any of it. She was home by the time the important parts happened. I mention her because the absence of her is part of why I was in the diner alone, which is why I was watching the room, which is why I saw everything I am about to describe. The young woman came in at around 8:15. She was in scrubs, the pale blue kind that the staff at the Naval Hospital near the base wore, which I recognized because my wife had a sister who worked there, and I had picked her up enough times to know the uniform. She was in her late 20s, I thought, with the particular tiredness that people carry after a night shift. Not the tiredness of someone who hasn't slept enough, but the specific dense tiredness of someone who has been working at high intensity for many hours and has only recently stopped. She sat down at the counter, ordered coffee, and looked at her phone with the quiet self-containment of someone who is using a small screen as a social buffer. She did not look at the 3 men in the corner booth. I had been watching the 3 men in the corner booth for about 20 minutes before she arrived, because they had the quality that draws attention from anyone trained in threat assessment. Loud in a specific way, present in a way that took up more space than the physical space they occupied, aware of the room in the way of people who are measuring it. They were civilians. I could tell by several things that I will not enumerate, but that add up quickly if you've spent enough time in mixed environments. They were not local, or not regular local, because Sheila the waitress hadn't given them the greeting she gave the faces she knew. The largest of the 3 had been speaking at a volume that required the other tables to accommodate rather than converse. He had complained about the coffee twice. He had spoken to Sheila in a way that contained a specific quality, not loud enough to be formally objectionable, but with an undertone that anyone paying attention could hear. When the woman in the scrubs sat down, he noticed her. I noticed him notice her. The specific quality of that attention is one I have learned to read in various contexts. It is the attention of someone identifying a target rather than a person. She was still looking at her phone. I was still looking at him. What happened next took about 4 minutes to develop and about 1 second to occur. And then it had occurred, and the diner was very quiet, and she had her hand to her face, and he was still talking, and I was already out of my seat. That is where this story begins. The rest is what I learned afterward about who she was and who her husband was, and what that meant for the man who had not thought to ask either question before he raised his hand. The 4 minutes before it happened had a texture that I recognized. It is the texture of escalation that has not yet reached the point of formal incident, the specific, pressurized quality of a situation developing toward something that everyone present can feel and nobody has yet acted to interrupt. I have been in that texture in operational environments, and I have been in it in civilian spaces, and the mechanics are largely the same. Someone is testing a boundary. The boundary is not being enforced. The testing continues. He had started by making a comment to his companions about the woman at the counter that was directed at her rather than at them. The kind of comment designed to be heard by the subject while maintaining the fiction of being a private conversation. The comment was about her appearance. It was not obscene, but it was not respectful. It had the quality of an opening remark. She did not respond. She did not look up. This is the part that I have thought about since. Her response to the opening remark was exactly correct. She gave it nothing. No acknowledgement, no reaction, no signal that it had landed. In an escalation sequence, that is the textbook response: do not provide feedback, do not create the interaction the person is seeking. It did not work because he was not looking for feedback. He was looking for an audience, and his audience of 2 was watching him, and that was enough. The second comment was louder, still framed as directed at his companions, but aimed at her more clearly. Something about her shift, about what she must have been doing. I will not reproduce the specific words. The specific words matter less than what they were designed to do, which was to make her feel visible in an unwanted way, in a public space, in front of people who were not intervening. She set her phone down. Not in response to him, she set it face down and placed both hands around her coffee cup. She was not looking at him, but something in her posture had changed. A small, precise shift in how she was carrying herself that told me she was now fully aware and had been aware for a while, and was deciding how to proceed with no good options. I was still seated. I had been deciding whether to say something and had not yet moved. The waitress, Sheila, came to refill his coffee. She did it quickly, the specific efficiency of someone who wants to normalize the environment and move on. She did not make eye contact with him. He said something to Sheila as she moved away. Something that was meant to be charming in the manner of someone who has never understood the difference between charm and dominance. Sheila smiled the smile that waitresses develop over years of managing that specific kind of comment and moved to the next table. He looked back at the woman in the scrubs. The third comment was the one that required a decision. It was quieter than the others, which was worse. The loud ones are performing for an audience. The quiet ones are just for the subject. It was about what she looked like sitting there, and it was the kind of comment that you cannot unhear and cannot pretend was ambiguous. She turned and looked at him. I was watching her face when she did it. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has made a decision, not a hot decision, not an angry one, but the cold, deliberate decision of someone who has assessed the situation and chosen a response. She said, calmly and clearly, "I'd like you to stop." The diner was quiet enough for everyone to hear it. He looked at her with the expression of someone encountering a variable that doesn't fit his model. Then he said something I won't write down, and he reached across the space between them. He was standing now. He had stood up at some point in the last 30 seconds, and he slapped her. Open palm, left side of her face, not full force, but not symbolic either. The specific force of someone who has decided to demonstrate something. She did not fall. She put her hand to her face and looked at him, and nobody moved. And then I moved. I covered the distance in about 3 seconds. Not running, moving with the specific deliberate pace that is faster than walking and slower than what your instinct wants. Because the instinct is not always the right tool, and I have had years of training to know when to override it. He was still standing. His companions had gone still in their booth, not with the stillness of support, but with the stillness of people who had not expected the situation to arrive at this point and were recalibrating. I put myself between him and her. I said clearly, "We're done here." He looked at me. I'm a gunnery sergeant with 11 years in the Marine Corps. I have a particular physical quality that I do not describe modestly or immodestly, but simply accurately. I am not someone who gets looked at and dismissed. He looked at me for a moment, and I could see him running the calculation. The same calculation he had been running at a lower level since he walked in and began testing what the room would allow. The calculation came back differently when I was the variable. He said something designed to save face for his companions and sat back down. I turned to the woman. Her hand was still at her face. She was looking at me with an expression I could not immediately categorize, not distressed exactly, or not only distressed. Something controlled underneath the immediate impact of what had just happened. I said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. It was a short word delivered in a tone that was working hard. Sheila appeared with ice wrapped in a cloth, which told me she had been moving toward this outcome from the moment it happened and had the presence of mind to prepare for it. She set it on the counter near the woman's hand. "I'm going to call the police," Sheila said, not as a question. "Please," I said. I sat down one stool away from the woman and stayed present without imposing. She put the ice against her face. She did not cry. She was looking straight ahead at the coffee machine, and I could see her breathing with the specific, deliberate rhythm of someone controlling a physical state through conscious effort. After a moment, she said, "Thank you." I said, "Of course." We sat. The three men in the corner were quiet. The diner had the specific quality of a space that has witnessed something and has not yet processed it, that particular suspended atmosphere that precedes the return to ordinary sounds. I asked her name. "Claire," she said. I introduced myself by rank and last name, the habitual introduction of someone in uniform even when out of it. She looked at me then, a brief, specific look of recognition. Not of me personally, of what I represented. "You're stationed here," she said. "Lejeune," I said. She nodded. She looked back at the coffee machine. "My husband is too," she said. I noted this and said nothing further on it. It was not relevant to the immediate situation. Or I thought it was not relevant to the immediate situation. That assessment was incomplete. The police arrived within 12 minutes. 2 officers, a sergeant and a junior officer who was clearly newer to the role by virtue of his specific alertness to the senior officer's cues. They spoke with Sheila first, then with me, then with Claire. Claire gave her account clearly and without embellishment. She described what had been said and what had been done and answered the officers' questions with the direct precision of someone accustomed to giving factual accounts of difficult situations. She did not minimize. She did not amplify. She reported what had occurred. The 3 men in the corner gave a version that differed primarily in its characterization of the first 3 comments, describing them as casual conversation rather than directed harassment, but which did not dispute the physical contact, because the physical contact had 11 witnesses. The larger man was cited for simple assault. He received the citation with the expression of someone who believes the citation is a formality that will not produce consequences he is not accustomed to managing. He was, I thought, a person who had spent his life in contexts where his size and his willingness to test boundaries had operated without significant cost. I watched him receive the citation. I thought, "You don't know yet what you've started." His name was Derek Sewell. I found this out from the police report, which I was given a copy of as a witness. He was 38, from Wilmington, a commercial contractor who came through the area several times a year for a client whose facility was near the base. He had 2 prior incidents on his record, both resolved without prosecution, both involving altercations in public spaces where his size and his apparent confidence in managing outcomes had served him adequately. He had a lawyer by the afternoon. The lawyer's name I found out later. What I found out first was that Claire had been contacted by a representative of Sewell's before the end of the business day with an offer to resolve the matter privately. The word used, as she told me when she called to thank me again and mention what had happened, was resolution. He was willing to provide financial resolution if she would withdraw the complaint. She had not withdrawn the complaint. The second contact came 2 days later, this time with a different framing. The representative, not the lawyer directly, but someone adjacent to him, had suggested that a formal complaint had the potential to become complicated for a young nurse at a military-adjacent facility. That the attention such a process draws is not always comfortable for the complainant. That what had happened had been an unfortunate incident involving a moment of poor judgment, and that formal processes tend to escalate things beyond what the original incident warrants. Claire told me this on the phone. She told it flatly, without editorializing, in the way she had given the police report. I asked if she felt threatened. "I feel managed," she said. That was a precise answer. What the representative was doing, and what people like Sewell usually do when the formal machinery begins moving, was attempting to reframe the situation. The original incident had been clear. A man struck a woman in a public space in front of 11 witnesses. The formal record was clean and consistent. The strategy for managing a clean, consistent record is not to dispute the facts. It is to alter the cost-benefit calculation for the person holding the complaint. Make the process feel expensive. Make the attention feel uncomfortable. Make the outcome feel uncertain enough that voluntary withdrawal seems like a reasonable form of peace. I had seen this strategy before in various forms. It works frequently enough to be a standard tool. But it requires the complainant to have more to lose than the person applying the pressure. I did not yet know the full dimensions of what the calculation looked like from Sewell's side. I knew Claire was a nurse at a military-adjacent facility and that her husband was stationed at Lejeune. I did not know her husband's name or rank. I had not asked, because it was not, in the immediate context of what had happened, the relevant information. On the fourth day, I found out. I was at the base gym when a colleague, a major in my chain I'll call Hoffman, came in and asked if I had been at the Anchor on Tuesday morning. I said yes. He looked at me with an expression that was partly amusement and partly the specific expression of someone who has just connected two pieces of information that produce a third. "The nurse," he said. "Claire," I said. "Claire Harmon," he said. "Her husband is Brigadier General David Harmon." I looked at Hoffman. "Joint Task Force Command," he said. 2 years from full general if the trajectory holds. I thought about the phone calls Claire had received. The representative suggesting that formal processes were uncomfortable for young nurses at military-adjacent facilities. The financial resolution. The careful management of her cost-benefit calculation. Sewell's lawyer had run a calculation. The calculation had not included the correct denominator. I said, "Does Sewell know?" Hoffman looked at me. "Does he look like someone who checked?" He did not. He looked, in my memory of him receiving the citation, exactly like someone who had checked nothing because checking had not, in his prior experience, been necessary. "Does the general know?" I asked. Hoffman paused. "He was at Camp Pendleton when it happened," he said. "He flew back yesterday." I thought about that. A brigadier general had flown back to Lejeune. His wife had been struck in a public space and had been approached twice by representatives of the man who struck her, suggesting she withdraw the complaint. David Harmon now knew those 3 things. Sewell did not yet know what David Harmon knowing those 3 things meant. I set down my weights. "This is going to be something," Hoffman said, with the tone of someone who is not wrong. I met David Harmon on the 5th day, not because I sought the meeting. He sought it. I was identified in the police report as the primary witness, and his JAG representative contacted me through my chain of command to request a formal interview. The request was framed correctly. Not pressure, not command influence, but a legal inquiry into the circumstances surrounding his wife's assault, to which I was a material witness. I had no reason to decline and several reasons to cooperate. We met in a conference room on the base. He was in uniform, not full dress, but service alphas, which in that context communicated something about how seriously he was treating the meeting without overdressing it. He was in his mid-50s. He had the physical presence of someone who had maintained physical standards throughout a career that required them, and the specific quality of attention that I have observed in senior officers who are genuinely good at what they do. Not the performed authority of someone performing command, but the actual directed intelligence of someone who has learned to see situations clearly because the cost of seeing them unclearly has been real. He shook my hand and thanked me for coming. I said I would tell him exactly what I saw. He said that was all he wanted. I told him exactly what I saw. I went through the sequence in the same order I had described it to the police: the initial comments, the escalation, the 4 minutes, the moment, my response, Claire's response, the police arrival. I did not editorialize. I did not characterize Sewell beyond describing his behavior in sequence. Harmon listened without interrupting. He had a legal pad in front of him, and he wrote some things on it, but he wrote less than I expected, which told me he was retaining more than he was writing down. When I finished, he asked 3 questions. All 3 were clarifying rather than leading. They were about timing, about proximity, about what exactly Claire had said immediately after. They were the questions of someone building an accurate picture rather than confirming a prior conclusion. Then he set down his pen. "He contacted her twice," he said, "privately before the formal process had moved. She told me," I said. "She also told me," he said. "She told me on the night I flew back." He paused. "She waited 2 days before she told me. She was managing whether to tell me because she knows how I respond to things, and she was deciding whether my response was going to help the situation or complicate it." I looked at him. "She's usually right about that," he said. He said it without irony and without false modesty, just as an accurate statement about a dynamic he had internalized. I said, "She's a composed person." "Yes," he said. "She is." He paused. "She's also been a nurse in military-adjacent facilities for 7 years. She has a specific professional calm that sometimes causes people to underestimate what she's actually processing. I thought about the woman at the counter with her hand on her face, looking straight ahead at the coffee machine, breathing with deliberate control. He asked me about Sewell's demeanor when he received the citation. I described it as I remembered it, the specific quality of someone who expects to manage outcomes. Harmon nodded. He wrote one thing on the pad. His lawyer has been active, he said, not as a complaint, as a factual statement. I gathered, I said. The approach to Claire was technically legal, he said. Civil resolution discussions are permitted before formal proceedings. The language used was measured enough to stay on the legal side of intimidation. He paused. Barely. She didn't withdraw, I said. No, he said. She didn't. Something in his expression changed for a moment, not sentimentality, but the specific weight of a person thinking about someone else's cost. She told me she wasn't going to withdraw because the next woman in that diner would have no record of who he was. I absorbed that. She had not stayed in the complaint because her husband was a general. She had stayed in the complaint because the next person in a diner with Sewell would benefit from a record that existed. She had framed it, for herself, not as personal consequence but as documentation. That was a specific quality. Harmon closed his legal pad. His lawyer doesn't know who I am, he said. It was a simple statement of fact. The approach to Claire was made without that information. I know, I said. I'm not going to use my position to apply command pressure to a civilian legal process, he said. That's not what this is. He said it with the clarity of someone who is drawing a bright line for both of us to see. But I have a legal team, and I have a JAG office, and I have 19 years of understanding how these processes work. And I'm going to use all of that correctly. I understand, I said. He stood and shook my hand. Thank you for being in the diner, he said. What Sewell's lawyer had filed by the end of the first week was a motion to dismiss the assault charge on the grounds that the contact had been non-injurious, and the characterization of the prior verbal exchange as harassment was subjective and not supported by the available evidence. The motion was technically coherent. Simple assault charges involving non-injurious contact and disputed intent have a meaningful dismissal rate in civilian courts, and Sewell's lawyer knew this. The strategy was not unreasonable given what he knew about the situation. What he did not know was the full shape of the situation. The first thing Harmon's legal team did was file a formal request to preserve all footage from the anchor on the morning of the incident. This was not a guaranteed request. Businesses are not required to maintain footage indefinitely, but it was filed within the window during which preservation was possible. There was camera footage. The anchor had a single security camera positioned above the main entrance, angled to cover the counter area. The footage was not high resolution, but it covered the counter, which included the woman in the scrubs, and it covered the sight line from the corner booth, which included the three men. It did not have audio, but it had sequencing. The sequencing showed him standing before the contact occurred. It showed the duration of the exchange, 11 minutes from when she sat down to the moment of contact, which was 11 minutes of documented proximity between the two parties that could not be characterized as incidental or unintended. Sewell's lawyer had not known about the footage. He found out when Harmon's JAG team filed a formal notice of additional evidence. The second element was the witness consolidation. Harmon's team contacted all 11 people who had been in the diner and formally requested written statements. 7 agreed to provide them. Of the 7, 6 described the prior verbal exchange in terms consistent with Claire's account, unprovoked, directed, escalating. The 7th described the exchange as uncomfortable without further specification, which was the kind of statement that doesn't help a defense. 7 statements. 11 minutes of footage. 1 very clean police report from a gunnery sergeant with 11 years of service and no prior formal complaints. Sewell's lawyer filed a second motion, this one seeking to characterize the prior verbal exchange as protected speech and therefore not admissible as context for the physical contact. This is a legal argument that exists. It is also a legal argument that, applied to a sequence documented in footage and corroborated by 6 independent witnesses, has a specific quality. It is the argument of someone who is running out of the more credible arguments. I found out about this progression through Hoffman, who was following it with the interest of someone who understands institutional mechanics and was watching a machine operate correctly for once. On the 9th day, something happened that had not been part of anyone's calculation. Sewell's client, the facility near the base for which he was a commercial contractor, contacted him. I do not know exactly what was said in that communication. What I know is the outcome. Sewell's contract with the facility was suspended pending the resolution of the assault charge. The facility's proximity to the military installation meant that personnel associated with it were visible to Base Command, and Base Command had interests in maintaining relationships with local civilian facilities that did not include the facility's contractors assaulting the spouses of flag officers in local diners. The suspension was not a legal consequence. It was a business consequence generated by proximity to the institutional world that Sewell had spent 11 minutes treating as irrelevant. He had not asked, in the diner, what world the woman at the counter was adjacent to. He had not asked what world the people around her were part of. He had read the surface and found it unthreatening and proceeded on that read. Surface had been accurate as far as it went. A young woman in scrubs at a diner counter, tired from a night shift, not large, not loud, not accompanied. From the outside, from a certain angle, she was exactly what he had treated her as. The angle was wrong. I spoke with Claire twice during this period, once to confirm my statement for the witness consolidation, once when she called simply to give me an update. She was calm in both calls, with the same quality of calm she had shown in the diner. She was not triumphant. She was not performing composure over distress. She was simply someone who had set a process in motion and was watching it proceed. I asked her how David was handling it. "Correctly," she said, "which is what I asked him to do." I thought about that framing. She had asked him to handle it correctly rather than powerfully, and the distinction had been important enough to her that it was the first thing she had specified. He had done what she asked. The process was moving. Sewell, from what I could gather, was beginning to understand that the situation he was in was not the situation he had thought he was in when he reached across that counter. The specific quality of understanding something too late is that you cannot begin the understanding until the moment that generated it has fully played out. He was somewhere in that understanding now. It was not finished. I had a conversation with Claire on the 11th day that I have thought about many times since. It was not about the legal process. That was proceeding in its own channel, with its own timeline, and she was not calling about it. She called, I think, because she needed to say something to someone who had been there, and the people closest to her were either too close to the situation or too far from the beginning of it. She asked me, with the direct quality I had come to expect from her, what I had thought in the moment before I stood up. I told her honestly. I had been deciding for about 90 seconds before the contact whether to intervene in the prior exchange. I had been running the calculus of a civilian space, the question of whether my intervention would escalate rather than de-escalate, the assessment of what the room would do if I inserted myself into a situation that had not yet crossed a definitive threshold. "What made you move?" she said. "The third comment," I said. "The quiet one." She was silent for a moment. "I heard you tell him we were done," she said. "You said it like a statement, not a threat." "It was a statement," I said. "That's the part I've been thinking about," she said. "Not what happened after, the legal things, the process things, that moment. You said we're done here and he sat back down." She paused. "He sat down because of what you represented, not because of what you said." I thought about that. "What he responded to," she said, "was the uniform or what the uniform meant. He was willing to do what he did in a room full of civilians because he had spent, I don't know how long, but a long time, operating in spaces where what he could do physically determined what he could get away with." Another pause. "And then you stood up and you were something different and the calculation changed." I said, "That's accurate." "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I want to be clear that I'm not saying it as criticism. I'm saying it as something I've been thinking about." She paused. "For the 11 people in that diner who watched it happen and didn't move, I understand that. I do. The cost of moving is uncertain and the cost of not moving feels more manageable in the moment. That's just human." She stopped. "But what it means for people like me is that the calculation for people like him almost always comes out in his favor because we don't carry what you carry." I was quiet. "I've been a nurse for 7 years," she said. "I work nights in a military hospital. I've seen what it costs people to be in bodies that are smaller or less threatening or just less recognizable as something that will fight back. And I've watched the same calculation play out in different forms in a lot of different rooms." I said, "What do you want me to say to that?" "Nothing," she said. "I wanted to say it to someone who would understand what it means." I thought about the specific weight of what she was carrying. Not just the incident had been handled. It was being processed. The legal machinery was moving in the right direction. The contract suspension was a real consequence. David was handling it correctly. What she was carrying was the longer understanding. The understanding that the incident had not been an anomaly, it had been a standard operation by someone whose standard operations work most of the time. The understanding that it had not worked this time because of a specific and unusual combination of circumstances. A witness who happened to have a particular background, a husband who happened to hold a particular rank, a lawyer who happened to access tools that most complainants cannot access. She knew that the other version, the version where she was alone in the diner, or where I had not stood up, or where David was an E4 rather than a general, would have produced a different story. The representative would have made the call. The financial resolution would have been offered. The complaint would have been withdrawn or dismissed. Sewell would have driven back to Wilmington. She knew that her outcome was not a function of justice. It was a function of position. The record will exist, I said finally. Whatever the outcome of the process. His name, the incident, the witness statements, the footage. That's what you said in the beginning, the next woman in a diner. Yes, she said. That's what I said. The record will exist, I said again. That part is done regardless of everything else. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said, for standing up. She meant it for more than the diner. I understood that. And I sat with the weight of what she had said for a long time after the call ended, the weight of what is protected by position and what is not, and what it costs people who are not positioned correctly to navigate spaces that should not require position to be safe. I did not have a clean resolution to that weight. I still don't. The assault charge was not dismissed. The motion to dismiss was denied by the magistrate on the 14th day, following a hearing at which the footage and the consolidated witness statements were entered into the record. The magistrate's written denial was brief and factual. The evidence of premeditation, in the form of the 11-minute documented exchange preceding the contact, was sufficient to establish intent, and the characterization of the prior verbal exchange as protected speech was not supported in the context of a sustained pattern of directed behavior with documented physical escalation. Sewell was scheduled for a formal hearing in 6 weeks. I found this out from Claire, who called with the same flat precision she brought to all factual updates. She did not express relief. She did not express satisfaction. She said the hearing was scheduled and she would be present and her statement was prepared. I asked how David was. Ready, she said, and constrained. She said it with something that might have been affection. He hasn't applied pressure, I said. He has actively avoided applying pressure, she said, which has cost him something. I thought about that. A brigadier general watching his wife navigate a process that his position could theoretically accelerate, actively restraining himself to the tools that were his to use correctly. That restraint had its own cost, the specific cost of having power and choosing not to use it outside the lanes where it belonged. He's a good person, I said. Yes, she said simply. The contractor facility's suspension of Sewell's contract became permanent after the denial of the motion to dismiss. This was a business decision made by private parties and had nothing to do with the legal process, but the legal process had provided the trigger. Sewell lost a significant portion of his regional revenue in one conversation, which I know because Hoffman tracked this through a mutual contact with connections to the local contracting world. The formal hearing, 6 weeks later, resulted in a conviction on the simple assault charge. The sentence was a fine and a conditional discharge, not incarceration, not a record-altering felony. A misdemeanor conviction on record. In isolation, it sounds like almost nothing. What it was, a documented record that could not be erased, attached to his name and accessible to anyone who looked. Future employers, future contracting clients, background check systems. The next diner, the next facility, the next person who was considering doing business with Derek Sewell and wanted to know whether there were prior incidents. There were prior incidents. There had always been prior incidents. What had not existed was a conviction. Now one existed. Claire had said on the first morning, the next woman in a diner. She had kept the complaint for the record. The record now included the conviction. I spoke with Harmon once more after the hearing. He called me to express his thanks in the direct, specific way of someone who has been in enough professional contexts to understand that thanks should be proportionate and accurate rather than effusive. He thanked me for the witness statement, for the accuracy of it, for being present in the diner, and for being present in the process. I told him I had done what was available to me. He said that was exactly the right way to think about it. He asked if I had any concerns about my own position, whether being visible as a witness in a civilian matter involving a flag officer had created any professional complications. I said it hadn't. He said that was good, and that if it did, I should let him know. I noted that he offered this not as a transactional exchange, but as a straightforward statement of obligation. He was a flag officer who had been helped by an enlisted man who had no obligation to help him, and he was prepared to reciprocate that help in an appropriate form if it became necessary. That was a clean transaction between two people who understood obligation. I said I appreciated it. We ended the call. I thought about everything that had happened from a Tuesday morning in a diner to a conviction in a magistrate's hearing. I thought about the specific chain of accidents and positions and choices that had produced this outcome versus the outcome that Sewell had assumed he was navigating toward. He had assumed wrong at every significant point. That did not always happen, but this time it had. My wife came back from Virginia on a Friday. I told her about it over dinner, the whole sequence, from the diner to the conviction. She listened the way she listens to things I tell her from operational contexts, fully present, asking questions at the right points, not filling the silence with her reaction until I was finished. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She stayed in the complaint for the record." "Yes," I said. She was quiet again. Then, "That's the kind of thing you only do if you've thought past yourself." I thought that was an accurate characterization. I have returned to the diner since. Not to revisit anything, just because it is on the road I travel and the coffee is reliably hot. Sheila is still there. She recognized me the first time I came back in and gave me the nod that regular customers give each other when something has passed that both parties were present for. I sat at the counter, looked at the corner booth, thought about 11 minutes. The conviction will not restore anything that was taken in those 11 minutes. The fine will not recalibrate what Sewell has spent his life believing about what his size and his willingness to test limits entitle him to. The record will not reach him the way real experience reaches a person. But the record exists. And Claire Harmon is still at the hospital, still working night shifts, still coming into diners when the shift ends in the specific exhausted way of someone who has given their hours to something that matters. She is moving through spaces where people will not know her husband's rank and will not know what happened in a diner on a Tuesday morning and will make their assessments based on the surface. Most of the time, nothing will happen. Once in a while, something will. And the record, if it matters, will be there. That is all the justice that was available. It was given correctly. It has to be enough.